Again, I want to address this question of what can we do. I agree with Laura that people are on autopilot from their childhood. I mean, we don't have a single friend who doesn't believe in climate change, and I think we don't have a single friend who wouldn't jump on an airplane tomorrow on a transatlantic flight, even though that consumes their entire CO2 allotment for the year. So I think that we can't just change people. If we start with young people, that's a generational change. We don't have time. The only thing that might change them is environmental catastrophe, and we then know it's too late. So I really think, I don't see any way we're going to change people. Advertising, sure, but where's the financial incentive in advertising? Their governments aren't going to pour the money into advertising, and industries are going to pour the money into advertising because there's no benefit in trying to convince people to consume less. So that takes me back to the government. Governments, I think, can actually do something here, have the potential to do something, and that's the only way we can really move. But I was speaking to Lucy Edwards, who's the Ashley Fellow who's been at Trent the last few weeks, and I said, you know, can you see a way that governments can do anything here? And she said, no, I do not believe they have the tools available. So we're to the point where I really don't think we're going to avoid climate change. We're in it, and what we have to be talking about, I think we have to maybe reform the dialogue to say, how are we going to deal with it? And perhaps when people see how serious it is to deal with it, they'll actually start to get the motivation to change their schemas. So I'd be interested in comments. I mean, for example, on CBC this morning, there's been a study that just says that by 20 years from now, there'll probably be very few outdoor skating rinks in Canada. Given the effect that that has on hockey, I actually think that we may be able to make some progress if we start to look at how we're going to cope with it and stop talking about how we're going to slow it down. Sure, we have to try everything we can to mitigate it. There's no question about that. But I think that the public dialogue has to be, how are we going to deal with it? And I'd just like to have your comments on that.
We've talked about choices that we can have and how perhaps to approach those choices. We've talked about policies somewhat. What we haven't talked about is the role that corporations play. And I think that the role that corporations can play can be a very useful role in turning things around if we take the time to understand how to influence how they act. I know that at universities it's a very controversial thing to say, but if a large company like, pick one, PepsiCo for example, goes to biodegradable packaging from renewable source, renewable biomass, the impact that that makes is so immense because they've already conditioned people to wanting to eat those Frito-Lay chips, they own Frito-Lay. So I think that corporations have a huge role to play and we need to inject them into the conversation. I refuse to believe that we need to just view corporations as evil entities. I sit on a number of boards and I've been involved with many, many companies. There are many of them predicated on only a profit line. Now Asaf, I'm sure we'll get into this, we need to convince them how to have a triple bottom line. Not just financial profit, but sustainable profit and community. So I think that's a very important part of this conversation. It doesn't really address your question, Al, but it injects another variable into this equation.
Al, this is a fundamental issue. The way we frame it in terms of organization studies is the first rule is you never try to change an organization by trying to change an organization. What you have to do is find doable spheres of influence and act on those spheres of influence. And I think that is also one of the fundamental problems is many of us have lost touch with where our sphere of influence is in terms of society. And I guess that's one of the things that excites me most about the Occupy movement, is I see a movement out there for social change where people have gotten in touch with my sphere of influence lies here and I'm going to act upon it. And I think that needs to be revitalized in a strong, strong way. In terms of the role of corporations, does anybody know who had the biggest impact on the price of organic broccoli in Canada? But the minute they decided, we get it, people want to buy organic broccoli, price dropped by 2/3 within several months because of economies of scale and so on. So we can find our sphere of influence in leveraging corporations to do certain things. But I think we're way far from exhausting our own spheres of influence in terms of moving forward. I think the fact that we are in a nation whose federal government doesn't seem to really see this as a priority, and we as voters sit back and say, oh, okay, I guess that's okay, you know, and not make that the number one issue in terms of where we're going to cast our votes. I think that speaks of us, and not understanding where our sphere of influence lies in that regard. So we're way before we've run out of choices in terms of doing that, and I think that is a major, major part of our solutions. Each and every one of us has to find where our sphere of influence lies and to exercise it accordingly and to do it with urgency and to do it as a way of finding positive opportunity.
Laura?
Just to add that too, because I think from my own perspective, I've sort of given the impression that all of this rests on the individual, which it does in theory, but you know, another thing that our discipline recognizes is the incredible importance to human beings of communities. And human beings are social animals, and the need for affiliation and belongingness in a community is huge. And, you know, the whole labor movement rests on the idea, you know, don't mourn, organize. If you want to get things done, then there's power behind having communities and being part of a sense of community. And there's a very interesting thing that's very much a cohort effect. It's very productive to try to build an immediate physical community of like-minded people who share immediate influences on your well-being. If that's neighbors, if that's an age group of people that have common concerns, a real physical community. And one of the things that technology has done is has actually made it easier to redirect our need for community into remote communities who have pretty much arbitrary influence in our immediate well-being. You know, the community of people who share our Facebook page, for example, are people who we will probably never meet. And ultimately, we may have those connections for very arbitrary reasons, like admiration for the same specific type of music. So some of that need for community sometimes, you know, is actually thwarted in some ways by some cultural and technological advances. So another thing that social psychologists do in the area of conservation psychology is start to use initiatives to build communities of people. Even if that starts with something small, like a meet your neighbor barbecue, or you know, getting together to discuss getting a bus stop close to our street. Very arbitrary little actions, but that then serves as an impetus for movement towards much larger communal actions. You know, once again, that's only one tiny little component of the puzzle, but it's something that can contribute to it.
Mm-hmm.